Again for coming and to thank our wonderful speakers for their presentation of the facts to us tonight. Thank you again.
She turned it off again. Thanks to Sue for your tireless efforts for the residents of Vestal. This is a nonpartisan evening. I do want to draw your attention to a chart that's in your packet and simply say this. This is a really important election. If you agree, do something. So I'd like to now introduce our second speaker. Elizabeth Radal is the managing attorney of Radal Law PLLC, and her practice is focused on commercial real estate finance, construction, and energy law. She is chairwoman of the New York State League of Women Voters Committee on Energy, Agriculture, and Environment, is also president of the League of Women Voters in the Larchmont-Mamaroneck area. Among many articles that she is the author of is one that's in your packet, which was the cover on the New York State Bar Law Journal back in November, December of last year. That's the Homeowners and Gas Drilling Leases, Boom or Bust. And her research has been sourced and cited in a number of places, most particularly in Ian Urbina's piece on drilling down, which I was actually just mentioning to a scholar in the room, is a really good source for documents and documentation on this issue. And as you've already heard, she foreshadowed the nationwide story that was on Susan Arbetter last summer. Oh, this summer. She's going to focus today on how gas drilling can impact the market value of our home investment and our tax base. I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Radal to Radal.
Good evening. How are you? Good. You good? Yes. I'm curious. I really want to target this. This is a very expansive topic, and I want to address you. We're here to talk about your home, your most valuable asset, and there's going to be some variability in what I would say depending upon whether people here have signed gas leases, whether you're thinking about signing a gas lease, if you might be living in between people who have signed a gas lease but would prefer not to, or if you live downstream. And I can address all of those issues, but we have a limited amount of time, and I want you to leave here tonight feeling as if I addressed issues of concern to you. So, and in addition, if we have elected officials here, are there any elected officials here? There's one. Good evening, and thank you for coming. How about, has anyone here signed a gas lease? And is anybody thinking about signing a gas lease? Considering it? And others, are you living in between people who have signed gas leases? Okay. And people maybe living in the general area and just curious? Okay. Like Greg, my intention tonight is to educate. I will say, though, I will go a step further. I have looked at the liability issues here. And what I write about, in addition to having looked at gas leases and mortgages, and I certainly concur with Greg that provisions in standard gas leases are at odds with what a mortgage would provide. What I've looked at are the liability issues. As a homeowner, you hold a deed to property. You are the primary party responsible for what happens on your property. Now, when you sign a gas lease, you would optimally want to have a provision in there that would delegate the responsibility to the gas company for any operations that they provide on your property, that they perform on your property. I've taken a look at numerous gas leases, the standard pre-printed leases, and I understand that most people in here have not signed them, but I want to just go through the basics because I think it will help you get an understanding of really how they operate. They don't have an insurance provision, and they don't have an indemnification provision in them. And so what that means is, as a property owner, you are potentially liable for the activity that is performed on your property over which you have no control. Gas leases give the drilling companies not only the right to come on and drill on your property, gives the gas drilling companies the right to establish roads, to establish utilities, to establish easements. And I'm not sure if you're all familiar with what easements are, but easements are typically rights that would go on for extended periods of time, sometimes in perpetuity, which means forever, okay, until they are revoked. And leases can potentially go on indefinitely, even though they have a term in the lease, a 5-year term. Once a driller is able to true up a well, make it capable of production, which are terms of art, and by that, it doesn't even necessarily mean that they've started drilling, but they can determine in some fashion that the well is capable of production, they start the clock ticking. And now your term goes on potentially indefinitely. So now think of yourself as having a piece of property, it's your most valuable asset, and up to now you thought you could do anything with it, much like that pen that somebody sold to me and they took out that, you know, the innards, right? Now all of a sudden you think that you have a property that you could do anything with. And in fact, what happens in the standard gas leases is that the homeowner is granting to the gas company the right to establish roads and utilities and easements potentially indefinitely, the right to store gas underground potentially indefinitely, and there's no provision in the lease for funding the maintenance and repair of all of these rights. And you have not delegated to the gas company the responsibility for these obligations, which means you remain potentially liable for all of this. It is my understanding that the landowner coalition leases have improved upon this. That may be the case. So let's take a step further. Let's assume that you do have an insurance provision in your lease, and assume that you have an indemnification. Now let's take a look at what the gas companies have. I've taken a look at Form 10-Ks. Those are documents that are filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. If you ever invest in stock and you want to take a look at a company and how they perform, if you look at the Form 10-K, and those are attached to the annual reports. If you go online, you could look up Cabot Oil, you could look up Chesapeake Oil, you could look at Range Resources, and in the back is a Form 10-K. And within that 10-K, they have something called the Risk Factors section. And in the Risk Factors section, and I brought it here, I can show people afterward if you're interested, they list what the risks are, okay? And the risks are, you know, I don't want to be dramatic, but the risks, this is an inherently risky practice. And I know that the industry does characterize this as something that is safe. This is not an inherently safe practice. This is a heavy industrial practice. And what distinguishes this from practices that have gone on in the past, because we often hear that we've been doing this for 100 years, so what's the big deal? Here's the difference. We have been hydraulic fracturing for a very long time, water fracturing rock. We've even been doing it with high volumes of water, but not for that long, but we have. And we've been doing horizontal drilling for a long time. But what we're doing now is we are combining two technologies, high volumes of water, and by that we mean millions of gallons of water, and you've heard about the chemicals, I'm sure, and the sand and all the rest of it, right? We're mixing that under very high pressure because we're exploding open rock that is a mile down, and we're doing it horizontally under people's homes. It's the combination of these two technologies, and we're doing it in people's backyards. That's what makes this different. We are not used to having heavy industrial activity in residential areas. I took a drive around this area this afternoon, and I was struck by, although not surprised, but struck by the variation from neighbor to neighbor. One neighbor is in favor of drilling, one neighbor is not. It's very obvious that this is a contentious issue. And what makes it challenging is that the activity, because it's heavy industrial, has risk involved. And that risk is not going to stay contained on the person's property. Air migrates, water migrates, seismic activity can impact property next door. So for those of you who are sitting in the audience, and most of the hands went up, are living next to people who might want a gas lease. Okay. So I'm going to jump ahead and I'm going to say, well, you're going to ask me about compulsory integration. Now, I don't know how much you know about compulsory integration, but it is part of the Environmental Conservation Law, 230901 of the Environmental Conservation Law. It's a long statute. It's not the easiest statute. It's a flawed statute. It was amended in 2005, and I want to say that it has not ever been tested in the courts for this type of drilling. So there were a lot of questions swirling around about it, but if anybody here were concerned about it, and one gentleman did come up to speak to me about it, where that could apply to people in this room, if you are sandwiched in between other people, okay, a drilling company would have to be able to demonstrate to DEC that it controls 60% of the land mass in order to be able to then force the other 40% into a spacing unit. That could be one person who owns 60%, or it could be a number of people. And then once a spacing unit is created, they could conceivably get a drilling permit. Now, I've looked at this statute. It's silent about whether or not you can use the surface of the property. And I have looked on the DEC website, and I have seen that it says, well, we're not going to permit the gas drillers to go on the surface of the property, but that's not what the statute says. I think it's a very ambiguous statute. Let's assume that the intention might be that they can come under your property. And so people, are contending that this would be eminent domain, private eminent domain. You're taking my property without just compensation. That might be one argument. There may be many arguments. There are a number of different theories swirling around, and I'm speaking with colleagues about what that all means. What I would suggest, if you're concerned about this, is that you write to Commissioner Martens and you tell him that you're very concerned about this. Now, some people would say, well, they're concerned because if you extract the minerals from under the property at a time like now, when gas is selling at an all-time low, you're not going to make the kind of money that you might make if you wanted to wait until gas is selling for higher value. I'm also looking at what happens if you want to have a mortgage on your property. Okay, I don't know. We haven't gotten there yet. We are making history right now, and I have to say that Greg May is somebody who really cracked this open. You've got someone in this, no, it's very serious, someone in this room who has alerted people in the industry. You would say, well, why hasn't this been an issue in other parts of the country? Part of the reason is because there are larger setbacks. Part of the reason is that drilling is more part of the culture in other parts of this country, even so in Pennsylvania. I think even in Pennsylvania, in some cases, they may have even gotten lenders' consent, believe it or not. But I do know that people did not get their lenders' consent when they signed gas leases in New York. And one thing that is very important for those of you in here, if you do not have homeowners insurance, you can't have a mortgage. It's not like a technical default, and I think Greg will agree with me on this. If mortgages are sold into the secondary mortgage market, which is another issue that I won't get into today, that's maybe for a Q&A, but we can't risk the collateral, because not only do you own your property, but my pension is invested in the secondary mortgage market, and probably many people in this room are as well. So whether or not we drill in New York, we care about maintaining the integrity of all the property that is drilled in this country, because you can believe it, our pensions are invested in this too. So that's a bit of a digression. But getting back to compulsory integration, I am not certain what a lender would do. Let's assume for a minute that you're not going to have any surface activity on your property, but your neighbor does. And let's say that your neighbor has a compressor station on the border of their property. Now, Gray was talking about setbacks, and I think for the most part, when people are underwriting loans, they're thinking about from the well bore to your residence. But what's interesting about the guidelines for these mortgages is they don't talk about the fact that this is a multi-step process. There are waste storage on people's property, there's compressor activity on people's property, there's even waste pits, although New York State is trying not to let that be the case. But the point is that conceivably people could have other aspects of this multi-step property life cycle close enough to their residence where even if they didn't have a gas lease on their property, they wouldn't be able to get a mortgage. And in fact, that has happened in Pennsylvania. Again, what can we do about this? The most that I can say is that you speak to your elected officials and you can say, my home is my most valuable asset, and my expectation is that I need to maintain the value of my property. And it's not only important to me, the homeowner, it's really important to your municipality. And why is that? Because it's your taxes that go to pay for the services in the municipality. So to the extent that your home value is devalued, your assessed value of your property will be devalued. Your taxes will go down. Maybe that's too simplistic, but I think that is most likely, let's just take it on faith, that if the value of your house goes down, the amount of taxes that you collect will go down. Now, recently, in preparation for this, I understand that it was said that, well, in Pennsylvania, properties are not having a problem with their value. So it's not so that we couldn't sell our property at a premium. Well, there's a very interesting study that just came out of Penn State. And I'm going to paraphrase. I do have the study. I'm not going to go read because I want to try to make the most of the time. But paraphrasing this, it is true that there are people in Pennsylvania who may be making good money on their property. They don't live on their property. Okay? So when somebody is an absentee owner, it may be that they don't necessarily care what's going to happen on their property. But in time, there is little question that as the minerals are extracted from the property, the closer one is to drilling activity, there is no question about this. It's documented the value of the property will go down. But getting back to Pennsylvania and the Penn State study, they demonstrated that the majority of the royalties in Pennsylvania are going to either absentee owners or a very small number of owners. They may be corporate owners, I'm not entirely certain, but these are not everyday, ordinary property owners that have a quarter acre of property. 90% of the property owners are getting 11% of the royalties. And the balance are going to people who are either not living in state or people who have very large tracts of land. So when you think about, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? What that means is the people who own the property aren't voting. And they don't necessarily care, okay, not necessarily, about what happens in the municipality. That's probably distinguishable from what's going on here, although I did drive by some properties today that are owned by commercial interests. Now we talk now about we want independence from foreign oil. I have here an article that talks about, and they call it independence. And this is just a list of the countries that own leases in America. So this is kind of a twist on all of this, but American companies do not necessarily own the gas leases on our property. We've got Australia, we've got the United Kingdom, Netherlands, China, Norway, India, Netherlands, France, Australia, China, Netherlands. And the states are Arkansas, Louisiana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, Louisiana. Chesapeake, as many of you may know, has a presence in this state. And Chesapeake is over-leveraged. And by that I mean they have borrowed so much money that they have to be selling off their gas leases now in order to pay back their loans. And to go back for a minute, gas leases are not only for gas drilling. And Aubrey McClendon, who is at the helm of Chesapeake, has even himself said, the money really isn't in the gas, it's in the land leases. We grabbed up the leases, we said we thought we had a good deal here, come on people and invest, and then they started so-called flipping the leases. And what has happened now is now you've got Chinese interests, Norway, what have you, who may control the drilling activity in the backyard of anyone here that has a gas lease. And one of the challenges is, when the drilling happens, if you want to know who is drilling on your property, it's not clear that if you go to the recorder's office, you're going to be able to figure that out. So when we get back to the liability issue now, okay, you have someone drilling on your property, and if something should happen, you want to be able to figure out who do you talk to. So first of all, you may have a challenge even figuring out the identity of that person. But going back to the 10Ks that I mentioned, I took a look at these 10Ks for a number of these publicly traded companies. These companies aren't fully insured. And it's very difficult to get full insurance. Even nationwide, going back to when Greg was speaking about this, they can't even quantify what the risks are. And of course, it doesn't make sense for a homeowner's policy to be insuring the drilling activity. Of course, that doesn't make sense. But what's important is when they're not going to renew your policy, okay? So what are you going to do in terms of recourse? If you don't have the protection on your property and you've got someone drilling on your property, or maybe even next door, because maybe many of the people in this room don't want to have the drilling activity, what I would say is this is where it's critically important that you communicate to DEC, you can communicate to your elected officials, to Governor Cuomo, that we should not be granting any drilling permits until we know that the gas industry is going to be fully funding their operations, because otherwise we're going to be subsidizing that. I would say apart from even being independent from foreign oil, which it really isn't, because actually we're probably going to be shipping it overseas right now because I think there's more money in that. We should just be independent from fossil fuel altogether, right? I mean, I happened to see this in the Times this weekend, but this is a cooling unit in a power pollution in the internet. We're a paperless society and we feel pretty good about that, right? Well, the amount of money that we spend to power our computers, it's formidable. And so why couldn't Binghamton and why couldn't the Southern Tier be the place where, renewable energy powers, why not, right? We can do this. We're very smart in this country, and I've got 5 minutes. So, let me just see what I didn't get here. Okay, I want to talk about, there was a really interesting article in something called the Smog blog. Oil and gas leases create conflicts for FEMA. You had a terrible, terrible summer last summer. You had Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. And FEMA will repurchase property. But this article seems to indicate, I just got this yesterday, but it seems to indicate that FEMA will not buy property with the intention of keeping it as open space, but they will not buy property that is subject to a gas lease. Well, why would that be? Because, much like analogous to a mortgage, you've granted a gas lease. If you've granted a gas lease, you've actually given some of your rights to your property to somebody else. So you don't have the right anymore to be able to give everything you own to FEMA. That may not be a consideration for people in this room if you have no interest in signing a gas lease, but if you're considering it, it is something, to think about. Let me see what else I've got here. In Ithaca, New York, they've done excellent work taking a look at preparedness from a taxation point of view. And Tompkins County has on their website a white paper and I'd be happy to give it to your elected officials. I know people do make fun of Ithaca, New York, but I have to say, and I've done a lot of reading, they've done remarkable work in preparing for gas drilling. And I would say that if you are thinking about gas drilling without preparing for what's going to happen in your community, then you're not serving your own best interest. There's going to be very heavy truck traffic here, and it's going to impact your roads. And unless you have a road ordinance, or unless you have a severance tax where you're actually taxing the gas at the wellhead where you can get access to the money up front, then the effect of that would be that the taxpayers are going to have to pay for whatever that's going to be, or you're going to have to live with a more degraded, quality of life, one or the other. The ad valorem taxes, which means added value, those are your property taxes. You will not see the tax dollars from the ad valorem taxes for a period of years, even assuming you were to start drilling now. Now, the economic environment isn't such now that any gas company is going to want to drill right now. It just doesn't make economic sense. If the gas companies come in right now, they're going to do it so they can preserve their leases. Okay? Because, again, they've borrowed money against those leases. And a lease is kind of like a mortgage, in a sense. I mean, some people actually have two investments on their property. If you think about it, they've got a mortgage and they've got a gas lease. And what's interesting is the mortgage, the intention of the mortgage is to keep the property safe for 30 years, and the intention of the gas lease is to drill. And in some sense, those are in conflict. Just in conclusion, there are obvious challenges here, and my sense is that people in the room are saying, well, what do we do? I think the governor is listening now, I really do. I think with people like Sue Rapp and Adam and Greg and other people in this room, we are speaking very loudly that, if this were something we were going to do, we need to make certain that it's not going to impact our natural resources, that it's not going to impact the value of your property, that it's not going to impact your tax base. That gas will be there. If there ever is a technology where we can, determine this, where neighbor can live next door to neighbor, and one person might be able to decide that it's going to be okay, but it's not going to impact the person next door. Under current technology, based on my own research, I don't see that that's possible. So I can tell you that I think that we want to make certain that if we are going to drill, that we delegate the responsibility to the gas company, but it's going to require everybody in this room writing letters, which is not fun, but that really is the only way to make the change. And because the citizens of this state have spoken about our concern about our property value, and that we do not want to subsidize this operation. It's fine if we're going to make income, and I do believe there are people that are making money, but if we do not look at the expenses, and they will be formidable, there's going to be emergency response, there certainly are fires, they go on for longer, the road repair, I'm sure people have heard about the leaked memo that was, hundreds of millions of dollars. These are going to be costs that are going to impact right here. And of course, you've got agriculture, maybe not right here, but you do have it in the region. You've got Binghamton University. You want to keep students coming here. You've got other economies that you want to keep alive. And you certainly want to infuse your tax base, and I understand that. And so the question is, in communicating with your own elected officials, how do you do that in a way so that your pocketbook, isn't taxed, and if the money coming in is something that you're able to keep in your pocketbook? Thank you.